An American journalist named James Foley was beheaded after being captured in the Middle East by ISIS terrorists. They have another captured American at the moment named Stephen Sotloff, who they're threatening to kill. Now, this journalist and, anybody who has to go through the brutality of the jihadist terrorist scumbags like ISIS, they're American heroes. I cannot get good information to report to you guys on the show if not for people like James Foley and other reporters on the ground doing really, really hard, really, really brave, really courageous, and life-threatening work. I oftentimes bash the media, but if you notice, I always talk about the mainstream media, CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, and the nightly news on TV. I always add the caveat, I'm not talking about the print outlets. I get all of my information for the show from the print outlets, and there are a lot of investigative reporters and hard workers and journalists on the ground in these war-torn regions threatening their lives to give us information so I can quote you statistics about Peshmerga Kurds, okay? So you have to give so much credit to these people, and they really are heroes. And the response to this beheading was appropriate, I believe. Everybody lashed out at ISIS. Even Obama gave a sharp speech on the issue. But then this raised an interesting philosophical and empirical question that I found myself debating last night. And that question is Islam worse than other religions? Now, there's probably going to be strong emotions on both sides of this argument. I know that I'm part of two communities, you can say. I'm part of the atheist community, and I'm also part of the progressive community. I oftentimes call myself an agnostic atheist, but I'm still part of the atheist community, and I'm part of the progressive community because although I call myself an international centrist or moderate in politics, in the U.S., I'm definitely progressive because our spectrum is so far to the right that the progressives have most of the answers correct. And those camps disagree on this, okay? Most people in the atheist movement will just say yes. Yes, Islam is worse than other religions. Stop it, right? And most people in the progressive community will say, no, that's not necessarily true. So which camp is right and why? So the back and forth that I got into, the debate that I got into, started after reading this Bill Maher tweet. He said, ISIS is one of thousands of Islamic militant groups, according to the New York Times. They behead another. But by all means, let's keep pretending all religions are alike. So I responded to that in a snarky way, of course not expecting Bill Maher to respond, but other people, the atheists and progressives and probably some conservatives, fired back at me like, oh, stop being snarky against Bill Maher, whatever. So, but I do want to seriously dive into this question and see if we can get a good answer. So first, I want to look at both sides of this. So let's look at the argument that, yes, Islam is worse than other religions. So what can they point to as their evidence? Well, people will say ISIS is a good example. I mean, there's not an equally vicious, jihadist, insane, brutal group like ISIS doing what they're doing today. They're the only group that's going around raping, beheading, being this extreme and on a consistent basis. So they point to ISIS, Al-Qaeda, very similar, of course, Al-Nusra Front. That's the official Al-Qaeda affiliate fighting in Syria right now. Boko Haram, I believe they're the jihadists in Nigeria. Al-Shabaab, also jihadists, I believe, in North Africa. Jemaah Islamiyah, I think they're in Indonesia. They're basically the Al-Qaeda of Indonesia. Ansar al-Sharia, the Mujahideen. You can point to the Taliban. You can point to some also slightly less radical, but at least partial terrorist groups like Hezbollah and Hamas. And then there are very brutal, very vicious, very repressive governments that are based on rigid Islamic codes. Now, look, whether you agree or disagree with the interpretation that these governments have of Islam, just understand they claim themselves that they're doing it in the name of Islam. So feel free to have that disagreement and that argument with them, the governments, and say, oh, you don't represent Islam or whatever, right? But they say we are representing it, and that's what our government is based on. And I'm talking about governments like Saudi Arabia, who just lashed a woman the other day 50 times and put her in jail for a month because she spoke back to the morality police. They kill atheists and kill homosexuals. Same thing in Iran, right? And, of course, there's different variations, Sunni groups, Shiite groups, so on and so forth, but there's some very extreme and some somewhat extreme ones and some more moderate ones, but nonetheless, this is all evidence that people can point to and say, this is proving that Islam is worse. Then there's the poll numbers. So let's look at the poll numbers. 74% of Muslims in North Africa and the Middle East support Sharia law. Okay, that's unacceptable. That's unacceptable. That's crazy. And then in Iraq and Afghanistan, that number is over 90%. It's stunning ignorance and stupidity. Also, 64% of Muslims in Egypt and Pakistan support death for leaving Islam. Now, look, you can safely say, guys, regardless of how uncomfortable this is, sorry, but it's a fact, that's certainly not the case in Christianity. There's not a 64% number of Christians that say, hey, if you leave Christianity, die. It just doesn't exist, okay? So let's accept facts when they're facts, all right? But let's also continue here. Of course, people can point to 9/11 and other various terrorist attacks that support the idea that Islam is worse than other religions. And it's also true that most international terrorism that's explicitly in the name of religion is committed by Muslim fundamentalists. Remember, listen to how I phrase that, because this is very important. It's going to come up later. Most international terrorism is committed by Muslim fundamentalists today. Okay? So that's the argument in favor of Islam is worse than other religions. Now let's look at the flip side of that. So polls indicate that, and from Pew and Gallup, that most Muslims don't really necessarily know what's in their holy book, okay? Just like Christians here in America, they think they know the Bible, they don't know the Bible, I know the Bible better than them, and I'm an atheist. Okay, so they say they support Sharia, but if you press them on what's in Sharia, they can't necessarily tell you. Okay, furthermore, 67% of international Muslims say they are somewhat or very concerned about Islamic extremism. Now, there's a million caveats to that and hedges. You could say, well, that depends. What do they define as extremism? And doesn't that contradict the previous poll that 64% said kill them if they leave Islam? Those are all fair points, but nonetheless, I got to get all the information out here. Now, going back through all the Pew and Gallup polls and looking at Muslim support for terrorism and Al-Qaeda and bin Laden, it's 9% to 12% of international Muslims that say they are sympathetic to the cause. Okay? Now, that's still an insanely high number, 9% to 12% of Muslims that are kind of like, yeah, I wouldn't blow myself up, but I support Al-Qaeda or I support, these jihadists or whatever. That's very high. And again, I want to be clear, that's not me saying it, it's the Pew polls and Gallup polls, when they asked that question, that's the response that they got, okay? So, the idea that most Muslims, though, support this beheading and Al-Qaeda and all that, that's not true. It's 9% to 12%. Now let's bring in other religions to the conversation and other ideologies to the conversation, because you can't say Islam is worse if you don't have anything to compare it to. So when it comes to the Christians, okay, they, of course, have the Crusades and the Inquisitions and burning witches, which, by the way, goes on to this day in Africa. They have mass child pedophilia in the Catholic Church. That should not be swept under the rug. It was systemic and systematic. And now, it's a fair response to say, well, some of that stuff is old and some of it is new. Fair enough, man. Grade it as you deem appropriate. I'm just giving you the information. And there's also various organizations that are either overtly Christian and violent and terrorists, or are violent and happen to be Christian, okay? And that's a slightly different thing there. So again, grade it as you deem appropriate. But I'll give you some examples. There's the KKK. They are overtly Christian. They're still a scourge, and they're resurgent in America right now, according to a lot of recent articles. There are abortion clinic bombers that are overtly Christian terrorists. There's the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda. They are overtly Christian, and they're terrorists. There's the Sovereign Citizens terrorists in the U.S. They are not overtly Christian, but most of them happen to be Christian, and they're right-wing terrorists. There's also 1,360 identified and recognized right-wing patriot/Confederate/militia groups that either happen to be Christian or are overtly Christian in the United States. Some more specifics. There was the Christian terrorist Paul Jennings Hill, who killed Dr. John Britton in 1994. There was Scott Roeder, of course, who killed George Tiller in 2009. There was Jim David Atkinson, a Christian terrorist murdered by the Unitarian Universalist Church in 2008. Who murdered the Unitarian Universalist Church in 2008. There's Wade Michael Page. There's John C. Salvi, who did the Planned Parenthood bombing in 1994. Eric Rudolph, who did the Olympic bombing in 1996. So there's plenty of examples of Christian extremism and terrorism. I haven't even brought up the Buddhists, how today a lot of people roll their eyes like, what do you mean violent Buddhists? That's insane. Not true. In Myanmar today, there's an epidemic of Buddhist violence against Muslims. Okay, very important to keep that in mind. It's brutal, it's vicious. Reuters has covered that fantastically. Vice did a great piece on that. Now, here's where it gets really, really squirrely to me. Does state terrorism count in the conversation? And if not, why doesn't it count? Should it count? Should it not count? If your religion is nationalism, okay, if what your brand of terrorism embodies every characteristic of religion, but it's just a state religion like nationalism, does that count? And so, for example, when George W. Bush invaded Iraq and said he was doing it for Gog and Magog in the Bible, as he literally said to the French president, doesn't that count as religious extremism? Shouldn't it count as religious extremism? And if you count that, then just on Iraq alone, the Christians blow the Muslims out of the water because we killed 200,000 minimum Iraqi civilians that died after our invasion. Okay? So, and do our 900 military bases count? I mean, in fact, most U.S. presidents are Christian, okay? And the country is 76% Christian. And post-World War II, the U.S. invaded Guatemala twice, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Grenada, Korea, Lebanon, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Iran twice, Libya 3 times, Panama, Iraq twice, Somalia, Yugoslavia, Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, the Philippines, Honduras, Nicaragua, Iran, Chile, and the list goes on and on. So, but do those things count or do they not count? Is the conversation just limited specifically to religion, or can we broaden it out to state religions and state-sponsored terrorism? And also, do we bring up the fact that the U.S. propped up dictators like Batista and Diaz and Mobutu and Noriega and Pinochet and Sadat and Diem, and the list goes on and on. So, is Islam worse than other religions? The answer is yes and no, because it depends. What criteria are you using? Here's one thing we haven't brought up yet. All religions are equally false and factually incorrect because they're all bullshit. So in that respect, no, Islam's not worse. It's just as false as Christianity. It's just as false as Buddhism or the Roman gods or the Greek gods. But in terms of international terrorism today, is it worse? Then yes, because it's a fact that there's more overtly religious Muslim terrorism in the name of Islam today, right, internationally. But then if you add state terrorism into that and consider that a national religion, well, then it's not really Islam that's the main problem. It's actually American imperialism. But then if you talk about just the U.S., well, in the U.S., 56% of domestic terrorist attacks in America from 1990 until today have been right-wing Christian terrorist attacks. That's from a study commissioned by the Bush administration and done by the Department of Homeland Security. Okay, so there's no bias here. There's no anti-conservative bias. It's just a fact. 56% of domestic terrorist attacks are right-wing and Christian terrorist attacks. So, and in terms of American Muslims, according to a Gallup poll, they are most likely to always reject violence against citizens. I'll give you the specific. 78% of American Muslims reject violence against civilians in all cases. Only 38% of Protestant Christians do, and only 39% of Catholics reject violence against civilians. Even the atheists finish behind the Muslims. Only 56% of atheists said we reject violence against civilians in all cases. So, look, the problem is the question is too gross and broad, okay? And the problem also is that you're implying blame on all Muslims for the actions of ISIS, and that's a little silly. Okay? Again, I don't want to be too libby progressive here and say, no, bro, everything is always totally equal. I'm going to do a false equivalence. No. Like I said, it's a fact that for specific religious purposes, today, internationally, Islam is the worst. There's no question about that. But it's also a fact that in the U.S., it's the Christians and the right-wing terrorists. And then also, when you add in state-sponsored terrorism and American imperialism, we're the fucking worst by a mile, right? So it's a complicated picture, and the answer is both yes and no, and that may be unsatisfying, but there's no other way to really answer the question specifically and directly and in the most accurate way.